The gunshot echoed through the quiet suburban street at 2:47 p.m. But what Officer Ryan Blake didn't know was that his body camera wasn't the only thing recording. Major David Carter's military-grade phone had been transmitting everything directly to Pentagon servers for the past 12 minutes. As blood seeped through Carter's decorated uniform, helicopter blades were already cutting through the afternoon sky. Before you click away, let me tell you how one traffic stop turned into the biggest federal intervention in police history. Drop a comment with your city below. I want to know how far this story reaches. The summer heat shimmered off the asphalt as Major David Carter guided his grandmother's burgundy Buick down Maple Street, the same street where he'd learned to ride a bike 28 years ago. The neighborhood had changed. New shopping centers replaced old corner stores, and the elementary school, where his mother had taught, now bore a different name. But the massive oak trees still lined the road like sentinels, their branches creating a canopy of shade that offered brief respites from the Georgia sun. David adjusted the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of his dress uniform hanging in the back seat. He'd worn it to the ceremony at Fort Stewart that morning, where he'd received his 3rd Distinguished Service Medal. Now driving in civilian clothes, a simple polo shirt and khakis, he felt the familiar comfort of anonymity that came with being out of uniform. After 15 years of service, 3 tours in Afghanistan, and countless nights sleeping in forward operating bases, there was something deeply satisfying about driving through his hometown as just another resident. His phone, secured in a military-grade case on the dashboard, buzzed with a message from his grandmother. "Don't forget the butter pecan ice cream, baby. It's the only thing that makes this heat bearable." He smiled, remembering how she'd always kept that freezer stocked with the same brand since he was a child. Some things thankfully never changed. The grocery list she'd texted earlier that morning ran through his mind. Milk, eggs, bread, those specific tea biscuits she liked from the British section, and of course the ice cream. Simple errands, normal life. After coordinating supply chains for entire battalions and managing logistics for operations that affected thousands of soldiers, picking up groceries felt almost meditative in its simplicity. David had arrived in town 3 days earlier, taking his first real leave in 18 months. The Pentagon had practically ordered him to take the time off. "You're no good to anyone if you burn out Carter," General Victoria Washington had told him during their last briefing. "Go home, see your family, remember what we're fighting for." He'd grown up in Riverside, this middle-class suburb 40 minutes outside of Atlanta, where his father had worked at the GM plant and his mother had shaped young minds at Riverside Elementary. It was a town that had produced its share of military officers, teachers, doctors, and engineers. The kind of place where American flags flew from every other porch, and where Veterans Day meant something more than just a day off from work. As he turned onto Commerce Boulevard, David noticed the patrol car in his rearview mirror. A Crown Victoria, the old model that most departments had phased out years ago. Riverside PD apparently still clung to them. The officer inside was following at a steady distance, not quite tailgating but close enough to read his license plate. David maintained his speed exactly at 35 miles per hour, the posted limit. His military training kicked in automatically. Situational awareness, threat assessment, defensive positioning. Old habits from convoy operations in Kandahar, where every vehicle was potentially hostile. But this was Riverside, Georgia, not Afghanistan. He forced himself to relax, loosening his grip on the steering wheel. The patrol car's lights flickered on, not the full light bar, just the subtle flashers that indicated a traffic stop. David's first thought was confusion. He'd been driving precisely at the speed limit, had signaled every turn, and came to complete stops at every sign. His grandmother's car had passed inspection just last month. He'd checked the sticker himself when he borrowed it. He eased the Buick to the shoulder, choosing a spot near the community center, where there were plenty of witnesses. Another lesson from his military experience: always control your position when possible. The patrol car pulled in behind him, its lights now fully activated, painting the afternoon in alternating reds and blues. David placed both hands on the steering wheel and watched in his side mirror as the officer emerged. Officer Ryan Blake, according to the nameplate that caught the sun as he approached. Blake was in his early 40s, David estimated, with the kind of build that suggested he spent more time at the gym than on foot patrol. His hand rested casually on his service weapon, though the retention strap remained fastened. "License and registration," Blake said without preamble when he reached the window. No explanation for the stop, no courtesy, just the demand. "Good afternoon, officer," David responded, keeping his voice level and professional. "May I ask why you pulled me over?" Blake's eyes narrowed behind his knockoff Oakleys. "License and registration." "I won't ask again." David nodded slowly. "I'm going to reach for my wallet in my back pocket, then get the registration from the glove compartment. Is that acceptable?" "Just do it," Blake replied, his tone carrying an edge of impatience that seemed disproportionate to the situation. David retrieved his license, his military ID visible in the same wallet pocket. As he leaned over to open the glove compartment, he heard Blake key his radio. "Unit 23 traffic stop on Commerce Boulevard, running a check on a burgundy Buick, possible stolen vehicle." "Excuse me?" David straightened, registration in hand. "This is my grandmother's car. Margaret Carter. She's lived here for 40 years. Blake took the documents without comment, his eyes lingering on the military ID. "Army, huh? You know how many people buy these fake IDs online?" "That's not fake, officer. I'm Major David Carter, stationed at Fort Stewart. I'm home on leave visiting my grandmother." "Step out of the vehicle," Blake ordered, taking a step back. David felt his pulse quicken. This was escalating without reason. "Officer, what's the probable cause for this stop? I haven't violated any traffic laws." "Step out of the vehicle now, or I'll remove you myself." Through his peripheral vision, David noticed several people had stopped on the sidewalk. An older woman he recognized as Mrs. Chen from his mother's church had her phone out, clearly recording. Good. Witnesses were always valuable. David opened the door slowly, narrating his movements. "I'm exiting the vehicle as requested. My hands are visible. I'm not resisting." As soon as his feet touched the pavement, Blake spun him around and pushed him against the car. "Hands on the hood, spread your legs." "This is unnecessary," David said, complying with the orders. "I've done nothing wrong." Blake began a rough pat-down, his hands aggressive and invasive. "You people always say that. Nice car for an army salary. You sure this isn't stolen?" "You people?" David's jaw clenched. "Officer Blake, your conduct is inappropriate and—" "Shut up." Blake grabbed David's wrist, twisting it behind his back. "You're being detained for suspected vehicle theft." "That's absurd. Call it in. The car is registered to Margaret Carter, 1847 Willow Lane. She's my grandmother." Blake clicked the handcuffs tight. Too tight, the metal biting into David's wrists. "Sure she is. And I'm sure you've got a perfectly good explanation for everything." More people had gathered now. David counted at least 8 bystanders, most with phones recording. From the community center, he saw James Martinez, who'd played football with him in high school, approaching with concern written across his face. "Yo, Officer Blake," James called out. "That's David Carter. He grew up here. That's his grandma's car, man. Everybody knows Ms. Margaret." Blake whirled on James. "Back up. This is a police matter. Interfere, and you'll be arrested too." "I'm not interfering," James said, holding his hands up but not retreating. "I'm just telling you you've got the wrong idea. David's a war hero, man. He's got a Bronze Star." "3, actually," someone else called out. Mrs. Chen had moved closer. "His picture is on the wall at the VFW. My husband served with his unit in Afghanistan." Blake's face reddened. The situation was slipping from his control, and David could see it in his body language. The way his hand moved back to his weapon, the aggressive set of his shoulders. "Everyone back up now," Blake shouted. "This is an active investigation." A second patrol car arrived, and a younger officer emerged. Officer Luis Gonzalez, according to his nameplate, looked fresh out of the academy. He surveyed the scene with obvious confusion. "What's the situation?" Gonzalez asked. "Suspected vehicle theft, possible stolen valor," Blake said loudly, ensuring the crowd heard. "Subject claims to be military, but can't verify his identity." "My military ID is in your hand," David said calmly. "My CAC card has a chip. Any federal building can verify it instantly." Gonzalez looked uncomfortable. "Blake, maybe we should—" "Rookie, secure the perimeter." Blake cut him off. "Keep these people back." David felt his phone vibrating in his pocket, the special pattern that indicated a priority military contact. Someone from his unit was trying to reach him. The phone still mounted on the dashboard would have automatically activated its emergency protocols when it detected the stress patterns in his voice combined with key phrases like "officer" and "detained." It was a security feature installed on all phones, issued to officers of his clearance level. "Officer Blake," David said, forcing calm into his voice. "My phone is receiving a military communication. May I inform them of my situation?" "You're not touching anything," Blake responded, then grabbed David's arm and started moving him toward the patrol car. That's when things went wrong. As Blake shoved David against the patrol car's hood, David's shoulder struck the edge hard. Military training kicked in, not to fight, but to protect his injured shoulder, the one that still bore shrapnel scars from an IED explosion in Helmand Province. He twisted slightly, trying to adjust his position. Blake interpreted the movement as resistance. "He's resisting," he shouted, though David had done nothing more than shift his weight. "I'm not resisting," David said, clearly aware that multiple phones were recording. "My shoulder is injured from combat. I'm trying to—" Blake's hand went to his taser. "Stop resisting." "He's not resisting," multiple voices called out from the crowd. James had moved closer, his phone held high. "We can all see he's not resisting." Officer Gonzalez stepped forward. "Blake, man, ease up. He's cuffed. He's controlled." "Shut up, rookie." Blake's face was now deep red veins standing out on his neck. The situation had spiraled beyond a traffic stop into something else entirely, a performance of power ego and barely contained rage. David made a decision. He went completely limp, passive resistance training from his SEER school kicking in. Make no movements that could be interpreted as aggressive. Become dead weight if necessary. "I am not resisting," he repeated in a clear, loud voice. "I am Major David Carter, service number 247-8890. I am complying with all lawful orders." Blake reached for his radio, clicking it off. Then he leaned close to David's ear. "You think you're special because you wore a uniform. You're just another—" The slur that followed was caught by at least 3 recording phones, though Blake thought he'd spoken quietly enough. Mrs. Chen gasped. James cursed. Gonzalez took another step forward. "Blake, that's enough. Let's just take him in and sort this out at the station." But Blake was beyond reasoning. The crowd, the recordings, the challenges to his authority. It had all combined into a toxic cocktail of wounded pride and unchecked power. He spun David around, slamming him back against the car. "You want to play soldier?" Blake hissed. "Let's see how tough you really are." David saw Blake's hand moving to his service weapon. Time slowed his combat instincts, screaming warnings. But he was handcuffed, surrounded by civilians. Any aggressive move would endanger innocents and likely end with him dead. "Officer Blake," he said, his voice carrying the command authority that had coordinated airstrikes and led men through firefights. "Stand down. You're about to make a terrible mistake." "Don't tell me what to do," Blake roared. Inside the Buick, David's phone had been transmitting everything for the past 12 minutes. The AI-assisted emergency system had identified the threat pattern. Elevated stress indicators, law enforcement confrontation, geographic location, and now the mention of a weapon. At Fort Stewart, an alert had already been raised. At the Pentagon, in a secure room 4 floors underground, an analyst was pulling up David's file while simultaneously activating emergency protocols. General Victoria Washington was in a meeting with the Joint Chiefs when her aide burst in, A breach of protocol that meant only one thing: an immediate threat to national security or personnel. "General, we have a situation. Major Carter is being held at gunpoint by local law enforcement in Georgia. His emergency beacon is active and we have live audio." Washington stood immediately. "Get me a direct line to the scene and scramble the nearest QRF. What assets do we have in the area?" "Fort Stewart's alert squadron can be airborne in 6 minutes. We also have an FBI field office 20 minutes from the location." "Launch them all," Washington ordered. "And get me the Attorney General on the line, if they harm one of my officers." Back on Commerce Boulevard, the situation had reached its breaking point. Blake had drawn his weapon, though he kept it at low ready, not quite pointing it at David, but making the threat clear. "Blake, no." Gonzalez moved between them. "This is insane. He's cuffed. He's not a threat. Move, rookie, or you'll be written up for interference." The crowd had swelled to nearly 30 people. Some had called 911 reporting an officer threatening an unarmed handcuffed veteran. The dispatcher, trying to make sense of the calls, had notified the watch commander, but the wheels of bureaucracy moved slowly. David kept his eyes on Blake's weapon. He'd been in enough combat situations to recognize the signs. Blake was losing control, feeding on his own adrenaline and anger, the kind of spiral that led to unnecessary casualties in war zones. "Officer Blake," David said, pitching his voice to carry to the recordings. "I am not a threat. I am handcuffed. I am complying. Lower your weapon." "Shut up. Just shut up." Blake's hand was shaking now, the weapon wavering. James Martinez had seen enough. He stepped forward, hands raised. "Officer Blake, I'm James Martinez. My dad's Robert Martinez. You know him? He owns the hardware store on 5th. We're all watching here. We're all recording. Whatever you're thinking about doing, don't. This isn't worth it." Blake's head snapped toward James, and in that moment of distraction, Gonzalez made a decision that would later save his career and possibly David's life. He keyed his radio, speaking clearly. "Dispatch Officer Gonzalez requesting immediate supervisor response to Commerce Boulevard. Officer Blake has drawn his weapon on a handcuffed, compliant subject. Multiple civilian witnesses present." The radio crackled with confusion and then urgent responses. But Blake, hearing the betrayal from his fellow officer, exploded. "You fucking rookie!" He turned on Gonzalez, weapon still in hand. The crowd reacted with shouts and gasps. Someone screamed, and in that chaos, with Blake distracted and waving his weapon, his finger found the trigger. The sound of the gunshot was impossibly loud, echoing off the community center walls. For a moment, everything stopped. The crowd frozen, phones still recording, but hands shaking, even the traffic on the boulevard seeming to pause. David felt the impact before he understood what had happened. A burning sensation in his left shoulder, followed by warm wetness spreading across his shirt. He'd been shot before. That IED and helmet had peppered him with shrapnel, but this was different. This was home. This was a street he'd ridden his bike on as a child. He slumped against the car, his legs giving out. Through the growing haze of shock, he heard screaming, saw Gonzalez wrestling with Blake for the weapon, heard sirens in the distance. "Shots fired! Shots fired!" Gonzalez was screaming into his radio. "Officer down! No subject down! We need EMS now!" Blake stood frozen, the weapon still in his hand, looking at it as if he'd never seen it before. The rage had evaporated, replaced by the horrible realization of what he'd done. In front of 30 witnesses, with cameras rolling. James Martinez ripped off his shirt, pressing it against David's shoulder. "Stay with me, D. Stay with me, brother." Mrs. Chen was on the phone with 911, her voice steady, despite her shaking hands, providing medical information with the precision of someone who'd been a nurse for 30 years before retirement. David's vision was starting to tunnel, but his training kept him conscious. Apply pressure. Stay awake. Control breathing. His phone, still in his car, had captured the gunshot and automatically elevated the emergency to critical. At Fort Stewart, helicopters were already spinning up. At the Pentagon, General Washington was striding toward the Emergency Command Center, her face a mask of controlled fury. "Ma'am," her aide reported, running to keep up. "Major Carter has been shot. Local EMS is en route, but our medical team will be there in 18 minutes. 18 minutes, Washington repeated. And federal marshals. 25 minutes out. FBI is mobilizing as well. Get me a direct line to that police department's chief. Then get me the governor of Georgia. Someone is going to answer for this." On Commerce Boulevard, more police units arrived the scene, descending into controlled chaos. A sergeant took one look at the situation. Blake standing there with his weapon, Gonzalez trying to render aid, a crowd of witnesses all recording, and David bleeding on the ground, and immediately took command. "Blake, weapon down now. On the ground." Blake seemed to wake from his trance, looking at the sergeant with confusion. He was resisting. "Weapon down, or I will drop you." The sergeant had his own weapon drawn, pointed at Blake. Blake finally set his pistol on the ground and stepped back. Two officers immediately moved in, securing the weapon, and then, to the crowd's approval, handcuffing Blake himself. David was drifting now, blood loss and shock pulling him under. But through the growing darkness, he heard something that combat veterans knew well: the distinctive thrum of military helicopters. Not medical evacuation birds, but Blackhawks. The kind that carried people who meant business. "The cavalry's coming, D," James said, still pressing the shirt against the wound. "Your people are coming." 3 Blackhawks appeared over the tree line, moving fast and low the way they did in combat zones. They circled once, assessing the scene, then 2 landed in the community center's parking lot, while 1 maintained overwatch. Before the rotors had even stopped spinning, soldiers in full combat gear were emerging, medics in the lead. The local police stood frozen, unsure of jurisdiction, of protocol, of what was happening. The ranking military officer, a colonel whose name tape read Harrison, strode directly to the police sergeant. "Colonel Harrison, U.S. Army. Major Carter is under our protection. We're assuming medical responsibility immediately." "This is a local matter," the sergeant started. Harrison cut him off. "Major Carter holds a top-secret clearance and is involved in matters of national security. This became federal the moment your officer shot him. Stand aside." The Army medics were already working on David, their movements precise and practiced. IV lines, pressure bandages, vital checks. All performed with the efficiency of people who'd done this under fire in much worse conditions. "GSW to the left shoulder," the lead medic reported. "Through and through, looks like it missed the subclavian. He's lucky." "Define lucky," Harrison said dryly, then turned back to the police sergeant. "Officer Blake is under federal detention as of now." "You can't?" "I can, and I am." Harrison produced a document from his tactical vest. "Federal warrant signed 15 minutes ago by a federal judge. Assault on a federal officer, deprivation of civil rights under color of law, and about 6 other charges that the JAG Corps is still adding." From the 3rd helicopter, which had just landed, emerged a figure that made even the veteran colonel straighten. General Victoria Washington, in full dress uniform, despite having been in a Pentagon meeting 20 minutes earlier, walked across the parking lot with the bearing of someone who'd commanded in Iraq and Afghanistan and wasn't impressed by small-town police politics. "Who's in charge here?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer was her. The police sergeant stepped forward. "Ma'am, I'm Sergeant Willis. This is our jurisdiction." "Not anymore." Washington's voice carried the authority of someone who'd ordered airstrikes and commanded divisions. "I have federal warrants, martial authority under the National Defense Act, and about 0 patience for whoever allowed this to happen." She looked at Blake, still handcuffed and now surrounded by military police. "Officer Blake, you just shot one of my best logistics officers. A man who saved more American lives through his supply chain management than you could count. He survived 3 IED attacks in Afghanistan, only to be shot by you on a street where he learned to ride a bike." Blake opened his mouth, then closed it. His lawyer, when he got one, would probably tell him that was the smartest thing he'd done all day. Washington turned to the crowd, many still recording. "I want to thank all of you for documenting this. Your videos will be crucial evidence. Federal prosecutors will be in touch." Then she moved to where the medics were preparing David for transport. He was conscious but groggy, the immediate medical intervention having stabilized him. When he saw Washington, he tried to salute with his good arm. "At ease, Major," she said softly, kneeling beside him. "Save your strength." "General," David managed. "Sorry about the leave getting cut short. The only thing you need to apologize for is not calling me to pick up your grandmother's groceries." She squeezed his good shoulder. "We're getting you out of here. Walter Reed's trauma team is already prepping." As they loaded David into the Black Hawk, with its advanced medical suite that rivaled most emergency rooms, the crowd began to disperse, but the impact was just beginning. Videos were already uploading to social media. #Justice for Major Carter would be trending within the hour. News vans were racing toward Riverside. And in Washington, the Attorney General was personally reviewing the case file that would become United States versus Blake. Officer Gonzalez stood apart from the other local officers, his decision to call for help and document Blake's actions, having separated him from the thin blue line. Colonel Harrison noticed and approached. "Officer Gonzalez." "Yes, sir." "You showed courage today. Integrity. The kind we value in the service." It wasn't right. None of it was right." Harrison nodded. "The FBI will want your statement. So will we. You might face backlash from your department." "I know. If you ever want a different career path, one where doing the right thing is rewarded instead of punished, give me a call." Harrison handed him a card. "We could use people like you." As the helicopters lifted off, carrying David toward advanced medical care and Blake toward federal prosecution, the sun was setting over Riverside. The community center's parking lot bore the marks of military helicopter landings. Commerce Boulevard had bloodstains on the asphalt. And somewhere in a house on Willow Lane, Margaret Carter was wondering why her grandson was taking so long with the groceries. The ice cream would melt in the Buick, forgotten in the chaos. The grocery list would remain uncompleted. But the videos would live forever, spreading across the internet like wildfire, carrying the story of a traffic stop that became a federal case of a hometown hero shot by someone sworn to protect and serve, and of the day the Pentagon came to Riverside. By the time the helicopters disappeared over the horizon, the first news vans were arriving. Within hours, Riverside would be famous for all the wrong reasons. Officer Blake's face would be on every news channel, his actions dissected by legal experts and condemned by civil rights leaders. The police department would face federal investigation, its practices scrutinized, its culture examined. But that was all to come. In that moment, as the crowd slowly dispersed and the remaining police tried to secure a scene that had already been documented from every angle, there was only the echo of helicopters and the knowledge that something fundamental had changed. The thin blue line had been crossed by the full might of the United States military, and everyone who witnessed it knew that justice this time would not be denied. James Martinez stood in the parking lot, Blake's blood on his shirt. No David's blood, he corrected himself, and watched the helicopters disappear. His phone had captured everything from Blake's first aggressive moves to Washington's arrival. He looked at the video, then at the upload button. "This changes everything," he said to no one in particular. Mrs. Chen, standing nearby, nodded. "It has to. How many times has this happened without cameras, without witnesses, without the Pentagon showing up?" "Too many," James replied and hit upload. The video would have 1 million views by midnight. By morning, Riverside would be the center of a national conversation about police violence, military service, and what happens when those sworn to protect become the greatest threat. And somewhere in a medical helicopter racing toward Walter Reed, Major David Carter was thinking not about his wound or the case to come, but about his grandmother waiting at home. Probably worried sick, definitely out of ice cream. The bullet wound would heal. The scars, both physical and psychological, would remain. But something else would remain too. The memory of that day when the system for once worked. When witnesses stood firm, when a rookie cop chose integrity over solidarity, when the military protected its own, and when justice arrived, not in months or years, but in minutes, carried on the blades of Black Hawk helicopters, and the determination of leaders who refused to let another injustice pass unchallenged. This was just the beginning of Major David Carter's story, but it was already clear that it would not end with him bleeding on a street corner, another victim of a system that too often failed those it claimed to protect. No, this story would end differently. This story would end with change. The medical helicopter's rotors beat a steady rhythm as it carved through the darkening Georgia sky, but inside the aircraft, chaos reigned with controlled precision. Major David Carter drifted in and out of consciousness, his mind fragmenting between the present and memories of other helicopters, other wounds. The medics worked with practiced efficiency, their hands steady, despite the turbulence, monitoring vitals and adjusting IV drips while maintaining constant communication with Walter Reed's trauma team. BP's dropping. The lead medic announced, his voice cutting through the engine noise. 90/60. We need to push more fluids. David tried to speak, but his throat felt like sandpaper. The medic noticed his struggle and leaned closer. Easy, Major. Save your strength. We've got you. Through the helicopter's window, David caught glimpses of the landscape below, transforming from suburban sprawl to rural darkness, punctuated by scattered lights. Each town they passed over contained people going about their evening routines, unaware that above them flew a Black Hawk, carrying a story that would soon dominate their news feeds and dinner conversations. General Victoria Washington sat across from him, her face illuminated by the green glow of her secure phone. She'd been fielding calls since they lifted off. The Secretary of Defense, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and now apparently someone from the White House. Her responses were clipped and professional, but David could read the fury beneath her controlled exterior. He'd served under her long enough to recognize the signs. "No, sir," she said into the phone. "This wasn't a misunderstanding. I've reviewed the preliminary footage. Officer Blake had multiple opportunities to de-escalate. Instead, he shot a handcuffed, compliant officer of the United States Army." A pause. "Yes, sir. The videos are already viral. We're past damage control. This is about justice now." The medic checking David's bandages whistled low. "You're lucky, Major. 2 inches to the right and we'd be having a different conversation." Lucky. David had heard that word a lot in his career. Lucky when the IED that killed his driver had only peppered him with shrapnel. Lucky when the mortar attack on his forward operating base had landed everywhere except his bunker. Lucky when the convoy ambush had been spotted by drone surveillance minutes before they rolled into the kill zone. But this felt different. This wasn't the calculated risk of combat. This was supposed to be home. His phone, now in an evidence bag beside him, continued to buzz with notifications. The emergency transmission had ended, but the device was still receiving messages. He could imagine them. Worried texts from his unit, calls from friends who'd seen the news, probably 50 messages from his sister in California, who had a Google alert set for his name. 5 minutes out, the pilot announced. Walter Reed has Trauma Bay 3 ready and waiting. General Washington ended her call and moved closer to David. The Attorney General is personally taking this case. Blake is being transported to federal holding as we speak. This won't get buried, Major. You have my word. David managed a weak nod. He wanted to ask about his grandmother, about who had told her, about whether someone had made sure she wasn't watching the news alone. But forming the words felt like climbing a mountain. As if reading his mind, Washington said, "Colonel Harrison sent someone to your grandmother's house. Chaplain Morris, you know him, right? He's with her now. She's tough, Carter. Tougher than most soldiers I've commanded." The helicopter began its descent, and through his haze, David could see the sprawling complex of Walter Reed below, lit up like a small city. Media vans were already gathering at the gates, their satellite dishes reaching skyward like modern prayer offerings to the gods of breaking news. The landing was smooth, and immediately the doors opened to reveal a full medical team. The transfer from helicopter to gurney happened in seconds, and then David was moving through corridors that blurred past in a stream of white walls and fluorescent lights. Voices called out medical terminology. He half understood, hands checked and rechecked his vitals, and through it all, General Washington stayed beside him, her presence an anchor in the chaos. Back in Riverside, the scene on Commerce Boulevard had transformed into something resembling a crime scene from a television procedural, except this was real, and the consequences would ripple far beyond the yellow tape. FBI agents had arrived in force, their Navy windbreakers creating a stark contrast to the local police uniforms. The Buick remained where David had parked it now, surrounded by evidence markers, each small yellow tent marking something significant. Blood drops, shell casings, the spot where Blake had stood. Special Agent Sarah Chen, no relation to Mrs. Chen from the crowd, led the federal investigation. She'd driven down from Atlanta the moment the case had been flagged as a federal civil rights violation with military implications. Now, standing where David had been shot, she tried to reconstruct the sequence of events, though the dozens of videos already in evidence made the task almost redundant. Agent Chen. One of her team members approached, tablet in hand. "We've got 43 separate video recordings so far, more uploading every minute. Social media is exploding." Chen reviewed the footage on the tablet, watching Blake's aggression escalate in real time from multiple angles. It was like having a three-dimensional record of injustice. "Download everything. Create mirrors. I don't want a single frame lost." Officer Luis Gonzalez sat in the FBI Mobile Command Unit, having just finished his third recounting of events. His hands shook slightly as he sipped coffee from a paper cup. He'd known Blake for only 6 months, having been assigned to him as part of his field training, but those 6 months had been enough to see the pattern. The random stops that always seemed to involve black drivers, the aggressive tactics with anyone who questioned his authority, the jokes in the locker room that weren't really jokes. "I should have done more," Gonzalez said to Agent Chen when she entered the command unit. "I should have stopped him sooner. You called for backup. You tried to intervene. You documented the incident," Chen replied, sitting across from him. "Without your radio call, the response time would have been even worse. But I didn't stop him from shooting." Chen studied the young officer. 24 years old according to his file. Top of his academy class. Commendations for community engagement during his short career. The kind of cop they needed more of, stuck with a training officer who represented everything wrong with the system. "Tell me about Blake's previous incidents," she said, pulling out a digital recorder. "Off the record for now, but I need to understand the pattern." Gonzalez hesitated, the thin blue line still exerting its gravitational pull despite everything. Then he thought about David bleeding on the ground, about the crowd's horror, about the arrival of those Blackhawks like avenging angels. "There were complaints," he began. "Lots of them. But they always disappeared. Sergeant Willis would handle them internally. Say there was insufficient evidence. Officer Blake had been on the force for 15 years, had connections. He knew which cameras to avoid, how to position his body to block dash cams, when to turn off his body camera and claim technical difficulties. But not today. No, not today. He was too angry, too focused on Major Carter to think about the crowd." Gonzalez paused. He kept saying, "You people," during stops, always with black drivers, sometimes with Hispanics, never with whites. Chen made notes. This was painting a picture of systematic bias that went beyond Blake to the department itself. "We'll need you to testify. Federal court." "Are you prepared for that?" Gonzalez thought about the card Colonel Harrison had given him, now tucked safely in his wallet. "Yes, ma'am. I am." Outside the command unit, Riverside was experiencing something unprecedented. News vans from every major network had descended on the small suburb, their reporters standing under bright lights with Commerce Boulevard as their backdrop. The community center had become an impromptu gathering place for residents who wanted to share their stories about Officer Blake, about Major Carter, about a police department that had failed them for years. James Martinez found himself at the center of it, his blood-stained shirt making him a powerful visual for the cameras. He'd already given statements to 6 different reporters, each time emphasizing that David had done nothing wrong, that Blake had escalated without cause, that this wasn't an isolated incident. David Carter served his country with honor. James told a CNN reporter the community center visible behind him. He survived Afghanistan only to be shot on the street where we used to play basketball. If the military hadn't shown up, if General Washington hadn't intervened, what would have happened? Would Blake be sitting at home on paid leave while they investigated themselves? The reporter, a veteran of countless police shooting stories, recognized the narrative power of this moment. "You recorded the entire incident. What made you start filming?" "Experience," James replied simply. "This isn't my first encounter with Officer Blake, but it's going to be his last." Margaret Carter's house on Willow Lane had become a fortress of kindness. Neighbors had gathered bringing food, offering support, creating a protective barrier between the elderly woman and the media trucks that cruised past, hoping for an interview. Inside, Chaplain Morris sat with her at the kitchen table where David had eaten breakfast just that morning, his coffee cup still in the sink. "He called me stubborn this morning." Margaret said, her voice steady, despite the tears tracking down her cheeks. "Said I should let him do all the shopping from now on, that these grocery runs were too much for me. I told him I'd been shopping for groceries since before he was born and wasn't about to stop now." Chaplain Morris, who'd counseled hundreds of military families through crisis, recognized the shock beneath her composure. "He's strong, Mrs. Carter. He's survived worse than this. In Afghanistan, maybe, where you expect danger, but not here, not on Commerce Boulevard." She looked at the chaplain with eyes that had seen the evolution of the civil rights movement, that had witnessed both progress and regression. "My husband marched with Dr. King in Selma. Did you know that he always said the hardest battles were the ones fought at home?" The television in the living room was on, but muted, showing aerial footage of Walter Reed where David was being treated. The chyron read, "Breaking Pentagon, confirms wounded major in stable condition." Margaret couldn't bring herself to watch the actual shooting footage that the networks were playing on loop, each replay, accompanied by panels of experts dissecting every second. At the Riverside Police Department, Chief Robert Thompson was having the worst day of his 30-year career. His office phone hadn't stopped ringing since the story broke. The mayor, the city council, the governor's office, and now the Department of Justice. Each call brought more bad news, more revelations about complaints against Blake that had been buried, more questions about departmental culture and oversight. Sergeant Willis sat across from the chief, his own career unraveling with each passing hour. "Blake was a good cop," he said weakly, though even he didn't seem to believe it anymore. He had strong opinions." "Strong opinions." Chief Thompson slammed his hand on the desk. "He shot a decorated Army officer in broad daylight on camera. And now I'm learning about dozens of complaints that you marked as unsubstantiated. We handled them internally. You buried them." The chief stood pacing to the window where protesters were already gathering, their signs visible even from 3 floors up. "Justice for Major Carter. Black Lives Matter. Prosecute Blake. Reform RPD. The union is going to fight this," Willis said. "They're already talking about Blake's rights, about due process." "The union can go to hell," Thompson interrupted. "The feds have jurisdiction. The Pentagon is involved. The president's press secretary just mentioned us by name. We're toxic, Willis, and it's our own damn fault." The Fraternal Order of Police Representatives arrived within the hour, their legal team ready to spin the narrative to find some justification for Blake's actions. But even they struggled when confronted with the video evidence. There was no weapon to plant retroactively, no resistance to exaggerate, no threat to manufacture. Just a handcuffed veteran bleeding on the ground, while Blake stood there with a smoking gun. At Walter Reed, David was finally stable enough for surgery. The bullet had indeed missed major vessels, but it had fragmented against his scapula, sending bone and metal fragments through the surrounding tissue. The surgery would be complex, but not life-threatening. The kind of precision work the Walter Reed surgeons had perfected through years of treating combat injuries. As they wheeled him toward the operating room, David's mind was clear enough to process what had happened. The shooting was traumatic, yes, but what struck him most was the response. The immediate military intervention, the federal warrants appearing within minutes, the media attention that made it impossible to bury the story. How many others hadn't been so fortunate? How many had bled out on streets without Blackhawks coming to their rescue? General Washington remained in the waiting room, having changed from her dress uniform to ACUs, ready for the long haul. Her aide had set up a mobile command post in a conference room, coordinating with JAG officers, federal prosecutors, and Pentagon public affairs. This wasn't just about David anymore. This was about every service member who'd faced discrimination, every veteran who'd been profiled, every soldier who'd been told their service didn't matter when confronted by local law enforcement. "Ma'am," her aide interrupted her thoughts. "The president wants to speak with you." Washington took the secure phone, straightening, even though the commander-in-chief couldn't see her. "Mr. President." "General, I've been briefed on the situation. How's Major Carter?" "In surgery now, sir. Prognosis is good. Full recovery expected." "Good, good." A pause. "Victoria, I want you to know you have the full support of this administration. Whatever resources you need, whatever pressure needs to be applied, you have it." "Thank you, sir. We're going to make an example of this case." "It's more than that," the president said. "This is about the covenant between America and those who serve. When someone puts on the uniform, defends this nation, and then comes home to face this kind of treatment, it's unacceptable, unconscionable." After the call, Washington walked to the window, looking out at the gathering media circus. She thought about all the Major Carters who didn't make headlines, all the veterans who suffered in silence, all the service members whose stories ended with a flag-draped coffin and a family wondering if justice would ever come. The surgery took 3 hours. 3 hours during which the videos of the shooting were viewed millions of times, during which justice for Major Carter became the top trending topic globally, during which Officer Blake was processed into federal custody and placed in protective isolation for his own safety. Blake's booking photo would become iconic, the face of police brutality captured not in the aftermath, but in real-time prevention. He looked smaller without his uniform, without his badge and gun, without the authority he'd wielded so recklessly. His lawyer, a public defender named Patricia Huang, who'd drawn the short straw, was already preparing an insanity defense, though she knew it was hopeless. The videos showed clear premeditation, escalation, and that fatal moment of decision. In his federal holding cell, Blake sat on the narrow bunk, finally beginning to understand the magnitude of what he'd done. He'd shot a man who'd survived IEDs and Taliban ambushes. He'd done it in front of dozens of witnesses. He'd done it while being recorded from multiple angles. And worse, from his perspective, he'd done it to someone the system actually valued enough to protect. "I want to make a deal," he told his lawyer during their first meeting. Huang looked at him with barely concealed disgust. "You shot an unarmed handcuffed veteran, on camera. The federal prosecutor has you on attempted murder, civil rights violations, and about 15 other charges. What exactly do you think you have to bargain with?" Blake leaned forward. "I have 15 years of knowing where the bodies are buried in Riverside PD. Every covered-up complaint, every planted evidence, every use of force that got written up as justified when it wasn't." Huang studied him. This was the calculation of a cornered animal, willing to burn down everything to save itself. "I'll float it to the prosecution. But Blake, even if you give them everything, you're still going to prison. The only question is for how long." As word of Blake's potential cooperation spread through law enforcement channels, panic set in at Riverside PD. Officers who'd thought themselves safe behind the blue wall suddenly wondered if their own actions would come under scrutiny. Complaints that had been dismissed were being re-examined. Videos that had been deleted were being recovered from cloud backups. The entire department was under a microscope, and what the investigators were finding wasn't pretty. Chief Thompson announced his early retirement that evening, effective immediately. Sergeant Willis was placed on administrative leave pending investigation. 3 other officers named in Blake's initial proffer were suspended. The department that had protected Blake for 15 years was crumbling in 15 hours. David woke from surgery to find his sister Angela sitting beside his bed. She'd flown in from California using her tech industry connections to get on a military transport when commercial flights were full. Her eyes were red with tears and exhaustion, but she managed to smile when she saw him conscious. "You always have to be dramatic, don't you?" she said, squeezing his hand. "Learned from the best." He managed his voice hoarse. "Grandma's okay. Worried, but okay. The neighbors have basically moved in to take care of her. Mrs. Chen is there now making soup." David thought about Mrs. Chen standing there recording, bearing witness when it mattered most. "The videos have changed everything," Angela finished. "David, you have no idea what's happening out there. This isn't just news, it's a movement. There are protests in every major city. The president mentioned you by name. General Washington has been on every network." Through the window, David could see darkness giving way to dawn. A new day was beginning, one that would bring more revelations, more consequences, more change. But for now, in this moment, he was alive. The machines monitoring his vitals beeped steadily, a mechanical reminder of his survival. "The ice cream," he said, suddenly remembering. Angela looked confused. "What?" "Grandma wanted butter pecan ice cream. It's still in the car." His sister laughed, a release of tension that brought fresh tears. "Only you would get shot and worry about ice cream. I'll make sure she gets a whole freezer full." General Washington appeared in the doorway, having waited for the family moment to pass. "Major Carter, good to see you awake. How are you feeling?" "Like I got shot, ma'am," David replied, attempting levity. "Well, your sense of humor survived intact." She moved closer, her expression serious. "David, what happened to you is going to be a catalyst. The Attorney General is using this case to launch a comprehensive investigation into police treatment of veterans. The President is signing an executive order requiring de-escalation training specifically regarding military personnel. Your sacrifice won't be in vain." "With respect, General, I didn't sacrifice anything. I was just trying to buy groceries." "Sometimes the most powerful moments come when we're just trying to live our lives," Washington replied. "Rest now. Tomorrow, if you're up for it, there are some people who want to thank you. The veteran community has rallied in a way I've never seen before." As she left, David closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to process. He thought about his tours in Afghanistan, about the clear lines between friend and enemy, about rules of engagement and the laws of war. Then he thought about Commerce Boulevard, about Blake's rage about the thin blue line that had protected bad actors for so long. The irony wasn't lost on him that he'd needed military intervention to survive a civilian police encounter, that the Pentagon had to flex its muscle to ensure justice for one of its own, that it took federal warrants and Blackhawks to arrest a single corrupt cop. But change was coming. He could feel it in the groundswell of support in the federal investigation, expanding by the hour, in the nervous whispers of police departments across the country, wondering if they were next. Blake had pulled a trigger, but he'd also triggered something much larger than himself. The morning sun filtered through the hospital blinds, casting parallel shadows across David's bed as his phone buzzed with its 100th notification. Angela had finally convinced the nurses to return it to him, though she regretted it immediately, as the device became a portal to the chaos erupting across the nation. Every major news outlet wanted an exclusive interview. Veterans organizations were organizing rallies. Civil rights lawyers were offering their services pro bono. The shooting of Major David Carter had become more than a news story. It had become a flashpoint. "You need to see this," Angela said, holding up her tablet. The screen showed a sea of people gathered in front of the Pentagon, many in military uniforms, holding signs that read, "Justice for our brother," And "We survived war zones, not street corners." David struggled to sit up straighter, wincing as the movement pulled at his surgical incisions. The footage showed General Washington addressing the crowd, her voice carrying across the plaza with the same authority she'd used in combat zones. Major Carter's blood is on that street because a system failed. But his survival and our response proves that we will not allow our warriors to be targeted, profiled, or murdered simply for existing while black. The crowd erupted in approval, a sound that made David unexpectedly emotional. These were his brothers and sisters in arms, people who'd faced death alongside him in distant deserts, now standing for him on home soil. "Sir," a voice from the doorway interrupted. David looked up to see Specialist Jackson, one of the soldiers from his unit at Fort Stewart, standing at attention despite the civilian clothes. "Sorry to intrude, Major, but the whole battalion wanted you to know we're here. We've got people rotating through, maintaining a presence. Nobody's forgetting this." Behind Jackson, David could see other familiar faces in the hallway. His unit had mobilized not for combat, but for support, creating a protective buffer between him and the outside world while ensuring their message was clear. An attack on one was an attack on all. Meanwhile, in Atlanta's federal courthouse, the machinery of justice was moving with unprecedented speed. Federal prosecutor Michelle Rodriguez had been personally selected by the Attorney General to lead the case against Blake. She sat across from Blake's attorney, Patricia Huang, in a sterile conference room that had hosted thousands of plea negotiations over the years. "Your client is looking at attempted murder of a federal officer, violation of civil rights, under color of law assault with a deadly weapon, and conspiracy charges related to the cover-ups he's admitted to." Rodriguez laid out methodically. "We're talking about 40 years minimum, possibly life." Huang had seen the evidence. The videos from 17 different angles. The audio from David's phone that captured every word, including Blake's racial slurs. The pattern of complaints stretching back years. Her client was guilty and everyone knew it. "He wants to cooperate," Huang said, though the words tasted bitter. "Full cooperation. Names, dates, incidents. Everything about the Riverside PD's systemic violations." Rodriguez leaned back, considering. "Cooperation might take the death penalty off the table for the federal charges, but he's still going away for a very long time. And that's if he survives general population, which given the current climate is questionable." The current climate Rodriguez referred to was evident outside the courthouse, where hundreds of protesters maintained a vigil. They held photos of David in his military dress uniform next to images of other victims who hadn't been fortunate enough to survive their encounters with police violence. The contrast was intentional and powerful. Here was a man who'd earned Bronze Stars and Purple Hearts, who'd led convoys through hostile territory, who'd saved lives through tactical brilliance, nearly murdered by someone who was supposed to protect and serve. Back in Riverside, the police department was hemorrhaging officers. Some resigned in solidarity with Blake, revealing their own prejudices in the process. Others left because they knew investigations would uncover their own misconduct. The few good officers who remained, like Luis Gonzalez, found themselves overwhelmed and understaffed. Gonzalez sat in the empty roll call room contemplating Colonel Harrison's business card. The FBI had offered him witness protection, knowing that testifying against Blake would make him a target. But he'd declined, choosing instead to stay visible, to be the cop who'd tried to stop it, who'd called it in, who'd chosen justice over the code of silence. "You did the right thing," Captain Maria Santos said, entering the room. She'd been brought in from Atlanta as interim chief tasked with rebuilding the department from the ground up. "I know it doesn't feel like it now, with half the force treating you like a traitor, but history will remember you as one of the good ones." "Will it?" Gonzalez asked. "Or will I just be a footnote in Major Carter's story?" Santos sat beside him, her own career a testament to fighting systems from within. "Every revolution needs its inside voices, the ones who say, 'This is wrong,' when everyone else stays silent. You spoke up when it mattered most." Their conversation was interrupted by commotion outside. Through the window they could see news vans congregating again, reporters scrambling to set up shots. Santos checked her phone and cursed softly. 3 more officers just got federal indictments based on Blake's testimony. This is going to get worse before it gets better. The 3 officers, veterans of the force who'd worked alongside Blake for years, were arrested at their homes that morning. The footage of them being led away in handcuffs, their own tools of power turned against them, would play alongside the video of David's shooting in an endless loop of accountability finally arriving. One of them, Officer Dennis Mitchell, had been Blake's partner for 5 years. The federal indictment detailed how they'd coordinated their stories after excessive force incidents, how they'd planted evidence to justify arrests, how they'd targeted black neighborhoods for random patrols that were anything but random. Mitchell's wife stood on their lawn screaming at reporters that her husband was a good man, that this was all a mistake, that the federal government was overreaching. But the evidence Blake had provided included recordings Mitchell didn't know existed, conversations where he'd laughed about teaching them a lesson and keeping them in their place. At Walter Reed, David received a visitor he hadn't expected. Marcus Thompson, no relation to the former police chief, was a retired Army sergeant major who'd lost his son to police violence 3 years earlier in Chicago. The case had been closed, ruled justified, the officers involved never even disciplined. He sat quietly beside David's bed for a moment before speaking. "My boy was 22. Marcus said, his voice steady but heavy with grief. "Just discharged from the Marines. Survived 2 tours in Syria, only to be shot during a traffic stop. They said he reached for something. There was no video, no witnesses brave enough to speak up, no Pentagon intervention." David listened, understanding that this man needed to share his story, needed someone who'd survived to hear about someone who hadn't. "The difference," Marcus continued, "is that you matter to them. Your rank, your decorations, your connections. They saved you. My boy was just a lance corporal. Nobody came for him." He wasn't bitter, just stating facts. "But maybe your case will mean something for the next lance corporal. Maybe the next time a cop sees a young black veteran, they'll remember what happened to Blake." "It shouldn't take federal intervention to get justice," David said quietly. "No, it shouldn't. But at least this time it came." Marcus stood to leave, then turned back. "Use this, Major. Use your survival, your platform. My boy can't speak anymore, but you can." After Marcus left, David stared at the ceiling, wrestling with survivor's guilt of a different kind than he'd experienced in combat. Why had he lived when so many others hadn't? Why had his shooting prompted immediate federal response when others were buried beneath bureaucracy and qualified immunity? General Washington arrived that afternoon with news that would reshape the national conversation. "The President is signing an executive order," she announced, entering with her usual commanding presence. "The Military Justice and Protection Act. Any crime against active duty or veteran military personnel can now be automatically elevated to federal jurisdiction if local authorities fail to act appropriately." "That's going to ruffle some feathers," David observed. "Good. Let them be ruffled." Washington pulled a chair close to his bed. "David, I need to ask you something. The media wants to hear from you. The country needs to hear from you. Are you ready for that?" David thought about Marcus Thompson's son, about all the unnamed victims, about the weight of survival. "What would you have me say? The truth." Your truth. What happened, how it felt, what needs to change." She paused. "But know that once you speak, you become more than just a victim. You become a symbol. That's a heavy burden to carry." "Heavier than a full combat load in Kandahar." David attempted levity. "Different weight. This one doesn't come off when the mission ends." That evening, from his hospital bed with Angela holding his hand off camera, David gave his first interview to a carefully selected journalist known for her integrity in covering military affairs. The interview would air simultaneously on multiple networks, ensuring no single outlet could control the narrative. "Major Carter," the journalist began, her tone respectful but direct. "Can you walk us through what happened that day?" David spoke carefully, precisely, with the same attention to detail he'd use in a military briefing. He described the stop, Blake's immediate aggression, the escalation despite his compliance. When he reached the moment of the shooting, his voice remained steady, but Angela's grip on his hand tightened. "I've been shot before," David said, looking directly into the camera. "In Afghanistan, you expect it. You're trained for it. You have rules of engagement, clear protocols. But on Commerce Boulevard in my hometown, wearing civilian clothes and driving my grandmother's car, I was more helpless there than I'd ever been in a combat zone." "What do you want people to understand about this incident?" the journalist asked. David considered his words carefully. "This isn't just about me. It's about every veteran who comes home expecting to be safe only to find that the uniform that protected them overseas makes them a target here. It's about a system that allowed Officer Blake to operate with impunity for 15 years, despite numerous complaints. It's about the fact that it took Pentagon intervention to achieve what should have been automatic: accountability for shooting an unarmed, handcuffed person." "Some are calling you a hero," the journalist noted. "I'm not a hero. The heroes are the people who recorded this, who stood as witnesses despite Officer Blake's threats. Luis Gonzalez is a hero for calling it in despite knowing it would cost him everything. The real heroes are the families who fought for justice without Blackhawks coming to their rescue, without federal warrants appearing in minutes, without the entire weight of the military establishment behind them." The interview continued for an hour, with David addressing everything from his recovery to his thoughts on police reform to his message for other veterans who'd experienced similar profiling. By the time it ended, Angela was crying silently, and even the camera operator seemed affected. As the journalist packed up her equipment, she paused at the door. "Major, off the record. What you said about not being a hero. The country needs heroes right now, whether you want to be one or not." That night, as the interview aired, the reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Social media exploded with support for David and calls for comprehensive police reform. Veterans shared their own stories of discrimination and profiling. Civil rights organizations announced coordinated campaigns for legislative change. The shooting that had lasted seconds was creating ripples that would last years. In his federal holding cell, Blake watched the interview on the communal television, surrounded by other inmates who knew exactly who he was. The federal marshals had placed him in protective custody, but even they couldn't shield him from the hostile stares and whispered threats. He watched David speaking calmly, articulately, without a trace of the hatred Blake himself felt burning in his chest. It was that composure, that dignity in the face of injustice, that finally made Blake understand the magnitude of what he'd destroyed. Not just David's sense of safety, but his own future, his department's credibility, and the thin blue line that had protected him for so long. Blake's lawyer visited him after the interview aired. "The prosecution is offering 25 years if you provide everything, every incident, every cover-up, every officer involved. It's the best deal you're going to get." Blake knew he had no choice. The alternative was a trial where that video would play repeatedly, where David would testify with the same calm dignity he'd shown in the interview, where a jury would see Blake for exactly what he was. "I'll take it," he said quietly, the words barely audible. "There's one condition," Huang added. "You have to allocute. Publicly admit what you did, why you did it, and express remorse." Blake's jaw clenched. Standing in court and admitting to being a racist who'd attempted to murder an American hero? It would be humiliating. It would destroy any remnant of the identity he'd built over 15 years in law enforcement. But it was better than life in prison. "Fine," he agreed, already imagining the courtroom, the cameras, David possibly being there to watch him confess. The news of Blake's plea deal broke the next morning, sending shockwaves through law enforcement communities nationwide. If Blake, with 15 years on the force and a union backing him, could fall this fast and hard, what did it mean for others with similar histories? Departments across the country began quietly reviewing their officers' records, looking for the Blakes in their ranks, trying to get ahead of potential federal investigations. In Riverside, Captain Santos used Blake's cooperation to clean house completely. Within a week, 7 more officers were under investigation. Civilian oversight had been implemented, and new policies regarding traffic stops, use of force, and accountability were being drafted. The department that had protected Blake was being rebuilt from its foundation. David was released from Walter Reed after a week, though he would need months of physical therapy to regain full use of his shoulder. The military provided a full security detail for his return to Riverside, not because of specific threats, but because his case had become too important to risk any further incidents. The homecoming was surreal. Commerce Boulevard had been transformed into a memorial of sorts, with flowers, cards, and American flags placed where he'd been shot. Someone had painted a mural on the community center wall. David in his dress uniform on one side, the scales of justice on the other, with the words, "Justice delayed is justice denied," connecting them. Margaret Carter waited on her porch, the same porch where David had played as a child, where his father had taught him to tie his shoes, where his mother had taken photos before his first deployment. She looked older than she had a week ago, the stress having added years to her face, but her embrace was as strong as ever. "My brave boy," she whispered, holding him carefully, mindful of his injuries. "My brave, foolish boy who just wanted ice cream." "I'm sorry I scared you, Grandma," David said, breathing in her familiar scent of lavender and vanilla. "Don't you apologize for getting shot," she said, firmly pulling back to look at him. "Don't you dare apologize for that man's hatred." Inside the house, the kitchen table was covered with cards and letters from across the country. Veterans, civil rights activists, ordinary citizens who'd been moved by his story. David picked up one at random from a 10-year-old boy in Detroit who'd written in careful cursive, "Dear Major Carter, thank you for your service both in the Army and for standing up to bad cops. My dad is a veteran too, and he says you're a real hero." Angela, who'd extended her leave from her tech job, indefinitely helped him sort through the correspondence. There were offers of book deals, movie rights, speaking engagements. Everyone wanted a piece of his story to package his trauma into consumable content. "You don't have to do any of this," Angela said, watching him become overwhelmed by the volume of requests. "You could just focus on healing, let the lawyers handle everything else." David thought about Marcus Thompson's son, about all the families who'd never gotten justice, about Officer Gonzalez risking everything to do the right thing. "No," he said finally. "If I don't use this platform, if I don't speak for those who can't, then what was the point of surviving?" The decision to speak publicly came with consequences David hadn't fully anticipated. Within days of his return to Riverside, his grandmother's quiet street had become a pilgrimage site for those seeking justice, hope, or simply to witness the place where everything had changed. Margaret Carter adapted with remarkable grace, setting up a cooler of sweet tea on the porch and treating visitors like extended family. But David could see the strain in her eyes. "We need to get you somewhere more secure," Angela suggested one morning as they watched another news van park outside. "This isn't sustainable." David stood at the window, his arm still in a sling, watching a mother with 2 young children place flowers at the makeshift memorial on Commerce Boulevard. The woman was crying, holding a photo of someone, likely another victim who hadn't been as fortunate. "They need this," he said quietly. "They need to see that sometimes the system works, even if it takes federal intervention." His phone rang with a blocked number which usually meant military or government. General Washington's voice was tense when he answered. "David, we have a situation. Blake's lawyer is trying to withdraw the plea deal. She says he's received death threats in federal custody, that his safety can't be guaranteed." "He shot an unarmed man in broad daylight," David responded, though he felt no satisfaction in Blake's fear. "What did he expect?" "The prosecution is worried if he withdraws his cooperation, we lose the cases against the other officers. His testimony is crucial for the conspiracy charges." Washington paused. "They want you to consider something unusual. A face-to-face meeting with Blake. Victim-offender mediation, they're calling it. The theory is it might convince him to stick with the deal." David's injured shoulder throbbed at the suggestion. Meet with the man who'd tried to kill him, who'd called him racial slurs while he bled on the pavement. That's asking a lot, General. I know. I told them as much. But David, if Blake's testimony can take down the entire corrupt network in Riverside PD, prevent future victims. She let the implication hang. After the call, David sat at his grandmother's kitchen table, staring at the spot where he'd eaten breakfast that morning before everything changed. Margaret brought him coffee, her movements careful and deliberate. "You're thinking about seeing him," she said. It wasn't a question. "How did you know?" "Baby, I've known you since before you could walk. You get that same look your father had when he was wrestling with doing the right thing versus the easy thing." She sat beside him, her weathered hands covering his. "Your grandfather faced men who hated him for his skin color too. Some of them wore badges, some wore hoods, some wore both. What would he have done?" Margaret was quiet for a moment. "He would have looked them in the eye and shown them what dignity looks like, not for them, but for everyone watching." 3 days later, David found himself in a federal facility in Atlanta, waiting in a secure room while Blake was brought from his cell. His lawyer, Michelle Rodriguez, sat beside him, having insisted on being present. Across from them, Patricia Huang reviewed notes with the kind of nervous energy that suggested she wasn't entirely comfortable with this meeting either. The door opened, and Blake entered in orange jumpsuit and shackles, 2 marshals flanking him. He looked smaller than David remembered, diminished somehow, like a deflated balloon. His face had aged years in weeks' stress and fear, carving new lines around his eyes. When he saw David, he stopped short, something flickering across his face. Shame, fear, maybe regret. "Sit," one of the marshals ordered, and Blake complied, the chains rattling, as he settled into the chair. For a moment, nobody spoke. David studied the man who'd nearly killed him, looking for the rage he'd seen on Commerce Boulevard, but finding only a hollow exhaustion. "Why?" David finally asked. "I need to understand why. I was handcuffed compliant. I posed no threat. So why?" Blake's jaw worked like he was chewing words before spitting them out. "You want the truth? That's why we're here." Blake laughed bitterly. "The truth is, I don't know. I mean, I know, but it doesn't make sense even to me now." He looked at his cuffed hands. "You were everything I wasn't. Decorated soldier, respected, accomplished. And you were black. In my head, those things weren't supposed to go together. So you shot me. I lost control." Blake's voice cracked. 15 years of being told I was the thin blue line that I was, all that stood between order and chaos. 15 years of believing that certain people were threats just by existing. And there you were, calm and dignified, while I was losing my shit, and the crowd was recording, and that rookie was questioning me. He trailed off. David leaned forward, his shoulder protesting the movement. "Those 15 years, how many others were there? How many didn't survive their encounter with you?" Blake met his eyes for the first time. "None dead, but injured, traumatized, too many. That's what I'm giving the feds. Every incident, every cover-up, every time Willis or Thompson made a complaint, disappear. And if you withdraw your cooperation, then they walk. Mitchell, Patterson, Cole, all of them walk. And they'll find new jobs in new departments and keep doing what they've always done." Blake shifted in his chair. "In federal prison, I'm a cop who shot a war hero. You know what that means? I'm dead within a month, maybe less." Huang interjected. "We are requesting protective custody for the duration of his sentence." Rodriguez responded sharply. "That's not guaranteed. Your client should have thought about consequences before pulling the trigger." David raised his hand, silencing both lawyers. "Blake, look at me." When the former officer met his eyes, David continued. "You took an oath to protect and serve. You violated that oath every day for 15 years. But right now, today, you have a chance to finally honor it. Your testimony can prevent other David Carters, other Marcus Thompson's sons, other victims we'll never know about." "Why do you care if I testify?" Blake asked, genuine confusion in his voice. "You want me dead. Everyone does." "No," David said firmly. "I want you to live with what you've done. I want you to wake up every day knowing you nearly killed an innocent man because of your hatred. And I want you to know that your testimony, your cooperation is the only valuable thing you'll ever do with the rest of your life." Blake's composure finally cracked. Tears rolled down his face as the weight of his actions, the finality of his situation crashed over him. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I know it doesn't matter, doesn't change anything, but I'm sorry." David stood wincing as the movement jarred his shoulder. "Your sorry doesn't heal my shoulder or erase my trauma, but your testimony might save lives. That's all that matters now." As David turned to leave, Blake called out, "Major Carter." David paused but didn't turn. "For what it's worth, you're twice the man I ever was. I see that now." Outside the facility, Rodriguez walked David to the waiting military vehicle. "That was powerful," she said. "Blake's lawyer already confirmed he'll stick with the plea. Your words made the difference." David felt no triumph, only exhaustion. Will it be enough? His testimony, more than enough. "We're looking at RICO charges for the entire command structure. This is going to reshape law enforcement in Georgia, maybe beyond." The ride back to Riverside was quiet, David processing the encounter while his security detail maintained vigilant watch. His phone buzzed with a message from General Washington. "Heard about the meeting. Proud of you, Major. That took real courage." But it didn't feel like courage. It felt like necessity, like one more mission to complete in a war that should never have reached American streets. When he arrived home, he found his grandmother in the kitchen with Luis Gonzalez of all people. The young officer sat at the table out of uniform, looking lost. "Officer Gonzalez wanted to check on you," Margaret explained, pouring coffee with the same hospitality she'd show any guest. "I'm not an officer anymore," Gonzalez corrected quietly. "I resigned this morning." David sat across from him, recognizing the look of a man adrift. "Why?" "Because even with Blake gone, with the others arrested, nothing really changed. The new officers coming in already know I'm the snitch, the rat, the one who broke the code. They're more subtle about it than Blake was, but the message is clear. I'm not welcome." "I'm sorry," David said, meaning it. "You did the right thing." Did I just wait until it was too late to matter?" Gonzalez's hands shook as he lifted his coffee cup. "I watched Blake for 6 months. Saw him escalate situations, profile drivers, use excessive force. I filed reports that went nowhere. I should have done more sooner." Margaret placed a gentle hand on the young man's shoulder. "Should have and could have are the devils that'll eat you alive if you let them. You acted when it mattered most. That's what counts." Gonzalez looked at David. "Colonel Harrison called me. The Army. They want me to consider applying for military police training. Said you recommended me." David nodded. "You showed integrity under pressure. We need people like you." "I wanted to be a cop to help people," Gonzalez said. "To be one of the good ones who made a difference." "Maybe you still can," David suggested. "Just in a different uniform." That evening, as David sat on the porch watching the sunset, his phone rang with an unexpected caller. Marcus Thompson, the father who'd lost his son. "Major Carter, I wanted you to know something." Marcus's voice was thick with emotion. "Since your shooting, since the response, 3 other families have had their cases reopened. Federal investigators are looking into deaths that were swept under the rug. Your survival, your visibility, it's giving us hope that maybe our children didn't die for nothing. Mr. Thompson, you don't need to say anything. Just keep fighting, keep speaking, keep being the voice our sons can't be anymore." After the call, David sat in the gathering darkness, wrestling with the weight of representation he'd never asked for. Angela found him there an hour later, bringing a blanket and sitting beside him in comfortable silence. "The prosecutor called," she finally said. "Blake's sentencing is next month. They want you to give a victim impact statement." David had known this was coming, had tried to prepare for it, but the reality felt overwhelming. How did you summarize the impact of being shot by someone sworn to protect you? How did you quantify the loss of safety in your own hometown? What would you say? He asked his sister. Angela considered. I'd tell them about the brother who left for war 3 times and came back each time a little more scarred, but still believing in service, in duty, in protecting others. I'd tell them how one racist cop with a gun almost took away not just your life, but your faith in the country you served. I'd make them understand that when Blake shot you, he shot every black veteran who's ever put on a uniform, believing it meant something. That's a lot of weight for one statement. You've carried heavier loads, Angela reminded him. Remember what Dad used to say, the hardest battles are the ones that choose you, not the ones you choose. Over the following weeks, David threw himself into physical therapy with military discipline, determined to regain full use of his shoulder. The exercises were painful, each movement a reminder of the bullet's path, but also of his survival. His physical therapist, a veteran herself who'd lost her leg to an IED, pushed him hard. Pain is just weakness leaving the body, she said during a particularly difficult session. Pretty sure that's just pain. David gasped, working through the range of motion exercises. You've been through worse. In Afghanistan, I knew who the enemy was. She stopped looking at him seriously. You still do. It's just wearing a different uniform now. Between therapy sessions, David worked on his victim impact statement, writing and rewriting, trying to capture something that felt true without being vengeful. He wanted Blake and the court to understand the ripple effects. How his grandmother now feared every police siren, how his sister had anxiety attacks when he left the house, how he himself couldn't drive past Commerce Boulevard without his heart racing. General Washington visited again, bringing news that would shift the narrative once more. The Department of Defense is creating a new position, Military Community Liaison for Law Enforcement Relations. It would involve training police departments on interacting with veterans, developing protocols for de-escalation, working to prevent incidents like yours. She paused. The secretary wants you to consider taking it. David stared at her. You want me to work with police departments? After this. We want you to help reform them. Your story, your credibility, your approach. You could save lives, David. Not through logistics this time, but through education and accountability. I need to think about it. Of course. But David, sometimes the best way to honor our trauma is to prevent others from experiencing it. That night, unable to sleep, David walked through his grandmother's neighborhood, his security detail maintaining a discreet distance. The streets were quiet, peaceful, in a way that belied the violence that had erupted weeks earlier. He found himself at the community center, where the mural of him still drew visitors during the day. A figure emerged from the shadows, James Martinez, carrying a 6-pack of beer and looking sheepish. Thought you might show up here eventually, James said. You always did come here to think when we were kids. They sat on the community center steps, sharing beer in silence, before James spoke again. You know, the whole neighborhood is different now. People aren't afraid to record the police anymore. They know what's possible when we stand together. One incident doesn't change everything, David cautioned. No, but it changes something. That rookie cop, Gonzalez, his testimony is going to convict multiple officers. Blake's cooperation is exposing decades of corruption. And you showed that even someone with your credentials, your service record, wasn't safe. If it could happen to you, it could happen to anyone, David finished. Exactly. That's why your story matters. Not because you're special, but because you're not. You're just another black man who got pulled over. The only difference is you survived and had an army literally come to your rescue. David thought about all the victims who didn't have Blackhawks and federal warrants rushing to their aid. Sometimes I feel guilty for surviving when so many didn't. Then use that guilt. Channel it into something meaningful. James stood, crushing his empty beer can. That position Washington mentioned, take it. Be the bridge between the military and police. Show them that serving your country doesn't end when you take off the uniform. A week before Blake's sentencing, another video surfaced. This one from a dashboard camera that Blake had thought was broken. It showed an incident from 2 years earlier, Blake conducting another traffic stop, another black driver, another escalation without cause. But in this one, Blake's partner had intervened physically, pulling him back before he could draw his weapon. The driver had filed a complaint that had been buried, but now it was evidence of a pattern even Blake couldn't deny. The driver in that video, Robert Hayes, reached out to David through his lawyer. They met at a coffee shop in Atlanta, two survivors of Blake's rage comparing notes on trauma and recovery. "When I saw what happened to you," Hayes said, stirring sugar into his coffee with a shaking hand, "I thought, that could have been me. Should have been me if Patterson hadn't pulled Blake back that day." Patterson was one of the officers arrested based on Blake's testimony, David noted. "He wasn't a hero. He just didn't want a murder on his shift. Still saved my life, even if it was for the wrong reasons." Hayes pulled out his phone, showing David a photo of his family. "My kids got to keep their father because one corrupt cop stopped another from going too far. How messed up is that?" "The whole system is messed up," David agreed. "But maybe that's why we need to be part of fixing it." Hayes studied him. "You're really thinking about taking that liaison position?" "Would you if you were me?" Hayes considered. "My grandfather was a Tuskegee airman, fought for a country that didn't even recognize him as fully human. Someone asked him once why he did it, and he said, because the only way to change a system is to be undeniably excellent within it, then use that excellence to demand better." Sounds like a wise man. He was. He'd have liked you, Major. You're doing what he did, using your excellence, your service to demand better. The night before the sentencing, David couldn't sleep. He stood in his childhood bedroom looking at the certificates and medals his mother had framed before she passed. His bronze stars, his Purple Heart, his Ranger tab, symbols of service that hadn't protected him from Blake's bullet but had potentially saved him from Blake's burial of the incident. Angela knocked softly and entered. "Can't sleep either. Keep thinking about tomorrow, looking Blake in the eye while I read my statement." "You don't have to go. You could submit it in writing." "No," David said firmly. "I need to be there, for everyone who couldn't be." The federal courthouse in Atlanta was surrounded by media and protesters when they arrived the next morning. Signs reading, "Justice for Major Carter," mixed with "End Police Violence," and "Black Veterans Matter." The crowd parted respectfully as David walked through, some calling out support, others simply bearing witness. Inside the courtroom, Blake sat at the defense table looking smaller than ever in his suit that didn't quite fit anymore. He'd lost weight in federal custody. His family sat behind him, his wife crying quietly, his teenage son staring straight ahead with a mixture of shame and anger. David felt an unexpected pang of sympathy for them. They were collateral damage in Blake's choices. The judge, Honorable Patricia Williams, entered with the bearing of someone who'd presided over countless cases, but recognized this one's significance. The courtroom fell silent as she took her seat, her eyes scanning the packed gallery before settling on David. "We're here for the sentencing of Ryan Blake, who has pled guilty to attempted murder of a federal officer, violation of civil rights under color of law, and conspiracy to obstruct justice." Judge Williams announced, her voice carrying the weight of judicial authority. "Before I pronounce sentence, we'll hear victim impact statements. Major Carter, are you prepared to address the court?" David stood, his dress uniform immaculate, his injured shoulder still slightly stiff as he moved to the podium. He carried his written statement, but found himself setting it aside, choosing instead to speak from the heart. "Your Honor, I've commanded soldiers in combat zones where death could come from any direction. I've been wounded by enemies of this nation who sought to destroy what we represent. But nothing prepared me for being shot by someone who took an oath to protect and serve in my hometown, on the street where I learned to ride a bicycle." Blake shifted in his seat, unable to meet David's eyes. His lawyer placed a restraining hand on his arm, keeping him still. "Officer Blake didn't just shoot me." David continued, his voice steady, despite the emotion underneath. "He shattered my grandmother's sense of safety in the neighborhood where she's lived for 40 years. He traumatized my sister, who now calls me multiple times a day, just to make sure I'm still alive. He betrayed the trust of every citizen who believes that law enforcement exists to protect them, not profile them, not assault them, not execute them on the street. In the gallery, Margaret Carter sat ramrod straight, tears flowing silently down her cheeks, while Angela held her hand. General Washington was there too, in full dress uniform, her presence a reminder of the military's investment in this case. But what Officer Blake didn't destroy, David said, now looking directly at Blake, was my faith in justice, because of the witnesses who stood firm, because of Officer Gonzalez, who chose integrity over the blue wall of silence, because of a system that, when pushed, chose accountability over cover-up. I'm alive to speak today. Many others haven't been so fortunate. Blake finally looked up, his face contorted with what might have been remorse or simply self-pity. It was hard to tell. I've met with families who lost sons, brothers, fathers to police violence. They'll never get to stand where I'm standing to see their attacker held accountable. I carry their stories with me now, their grief added to my own trauma. When Officer Blake shot me, he didn't just attack me. He attacked every black person who's ever been pulled over and wondered if they'd make it home, every veteran who's been treated as a threat rather than a hero, every citizen who believes in the promise of equal justice under law. David paused, collecting himself, aware that every word was being recorded, would be analyzed, would become part of the historical record. Your Honor, I'm not asking for vengeance. I'm asking for justice. Not just for me, but for all the victims who came before, and all the potential victims who might be saved, if this sentence sends a clear message that a badge is not a license to kill, that a uniform, whether military or police, demands accountability, not immunity. He turned to address Blake directly. You told me you're sorry. Prove it. Use your remaining years to speak out against the culture that created you, that enabled you, that protected you until you went too far to ignore. That's the only redemption available to you now. David returned to his seat, the courtroom so quiet that the sound of his footsteps seemed to echo. Judge Williams nodded thoughtfully, making notes before calling for other statements. Robert Hayes, the man who'd survived Blake 2 years earlier, spoke next, his voice shaking as he described the nightmares, the fear of police that had infected his children, the therapy bills that insurance wouldn't cover. Mrs. Chen, from the crowd that day, testified about the terror of watching Blake shoot an unarmed man, the helplessness of witnessing what she was certain would be murder. Then, unexpectedly, Luis Gonzalez approached the podium. He wasn't scheduled to speak, but Judge Williams allowed it. Your Honor, I was a police officer for exactly 8 months. Gonzalez began, his voice stronger than it had been in weeks. I joined the force to protect and serve, to be one of the good ones. But I learned quickly that being good wasn't enough if you stayed silent when others were bad. I failed Major Carter by not acting sooner, by not reporting Blake's pattern of abuse when I first witnessed it. My silence made me complicit. Blake's head snapped up, staring at his former partner with something like betrayal. But when it mattered most, Gonzalez continued, I chose to act. I called for backup. I documented the shooting. I testified truthfully despite knowing it would end my career. I'm not asking for praise. I'm asking this court to recognize that Officer Blake wasn't a bad apple. He was the product of a rotten system that I was briefly part of. That system needs to be torn down and rebuilt, and that starts with accountability. After all the statements concluded, Judge Williams called for a recess. The courtroom erupted in whispered conversations as people processed what they'd heard. David stepped outside for air, finding Marcus Thompson waiting in the hallway. That was powerful, Major, Marcus said, shaking David's hand. My son would have been proud. I just hope it makes a difference. It already has. 3 more departments announced reform initiatives this week. The Pentagon's new training program for police veteran interactions starts next month. Change is slow, but it's coming. When court reconvened, Blake was given the opportunity to speak before sentencing. He stood slowly, his hands trembling as he unfolded a paper. I've had time to think about what I did. Blake began, his voice barely audible. To really think about it. Major Carter asked me why, and I gave him reasons. But they weren't really reasons. They were excuses. The truth is simpler and uglier. I was a racist with a badge and a gun, and the system let me be one for 15 years. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Even Blake's lawyer looked surprised by the admission. I shot Major Carter because he was black and I could. Because I'd gotten away with lesser violence so many times that I thought I was untouchable. Because I saw his dignity, his accomplishment, his refusal to cower. And it threatened everything I believed about myself and my place in the world. Blake turned to look at David directly. You asked me to use my remaining years to speak against the culture that created me. I will. Not because it will redeem me, nothing can do that, but because maybe somewhere there's another cop like me who needs to hear that the path I chose leads only to destruction. He sat down heavily, seeming to deflate with the effort of honesty. Judge Williams studied him for a long moment before speaking. Mr. Blake, you've admitted to not just attempted murder, but to a pattern of civil rights violations spanning your entire career. You've confessed to racism, to abuse of power, to conspiracy with other officers to cover up crimes. Your cooperation has led to additional arrests and will likely result in the complete restructuring of the Riverside Police Department. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. However, cooperation after the fact does not erase the crime. Major Carter could have died. That he survived is not due to your restraint, but to luck and immediate medical intervention. You shot an unarmed, handcuffed veteran who had committed no crime in front of dozens of witnesses because of the color of his skin. Blake's wife sobbed quietly in the gallery. His son had already left, unable to watch his father's complete destruction. Therefore, Judge Williams continued, I sentence you to 25 years in federal prison with the possibility of parole after 20 years contingent upon your continued cooperation and demonstrated rehabilitation. You will serve your time in protective custody, not as a kindness to you, but to ensure you live to fulfill your commitment to testify against your co-conspirators. The gavel came down with finality. Blake was immediately taken into custody, not even allowed to say goodbye to his family. As the marshals led him away, he looked back once at David, nodding slightly. An acknowledgement of something. Perhaps defeat, perhaps understanding, perhaps just exhaustion. Outside the courthouse, the crowd had grown larger. When David emerged, a cheer went up that could be heard blocks away. Reporters surged forward, but General Washington and a phalanx of military personnel created a protective corridor. Major Carter, how do you feel about the sentence? One reporter managed to shout. David paused, considering. I feel like justice was served, but the work isn't done. One conviction doesn't fix a broken system. We need comprehensive reform, accountability at every level, and a fundamental shift in how law enforcement views the communities they serve. Will you accept the Pentagon's liaison position? Another called out. Yes, David said, the decision crystallizing in that moment. I will. Because the best way to honor what happened to me is to prevent it from happening to others. The crowd erupted again, this time with approval and hope. As David made his way to the waiting vehicle, people reached out to shake his hand, to offer thanks, to share their own stories in hurried whispers. Each touch, each word added to the weight of responsibility he now carried. The drive back to Riverside was quiet, David processing everything that had happened. Angela sat beside him occasionally, squeezing his hand when the emotion became too much. Margaret had gone ahead with Chaplain Morris, needing the comfort of her own home after the intensity of the courtroom. 25 years, Angela finally said. Is it enough? No amount of time would be enough to undo what he did, David replied. But it's accountability. It's acknowledgement. It's more than most victims get. As they passed Commerce Boulevard, David noticed the memorial had grown. Fresh flowers, new signs, more photos of other victims added to his. The community center mural had been expanded now, showing not just David, but a collection of faces, veterans and civilians alike who'd faced police violence. The artist had added a phrase at the bottom: We remember, we resist, we rise. That evening, Riverside held a community gathering at the center. David hadn't planned to attend, exhausted from the emotional toll of the day. But when he saw the crowd gathering, he knew he needed to be there. These were his neighbors, the people who'd witnessed his shooting, who'd stood firm when Blake had tried to intimidate them. James Martinez had organized the event, transforming the community center into a space for healing and planning. Tables were set up with voter registration forms, information about civilian oversight boards, and resources for those who'd experienced police violence. "We can't just celebrate today's verdict," James addressed the crowd. "We have to use this momentum to create lasting change. Major Carter's shooting woke us up, but staying awake, that's on us." Sarah Chen, the FBI agent who'd led the federal investigation, was there in civilian clothes. She approached David during a quiet moment. "The investigation has expanded," she told him quietly. "Blake's testimony has opened doors to departments across 3 states. We're looking at one of the largest civil rights investigations in decades." "All from one traffic stop," David mused. "All from one traffic stop where people refused to look away," Chen corrected. "Where witnesses stood firm, where a rookie cop chose integrity, where the military demanded justice. It takes all of that to break these patterns." As the evening progressed, David found himself surrounded by veterans who'd traveled from across the country to be there. They shared their own stories of profiling, of being seen as threats, despite their service, of coming home from war only to face different battles on American streets. A young Marine, barely old enough to have served one tour, approached hesitantly. "Sir, I just wanted to say, what happened to you, it made me realize I wasn't paranoid. The cops in my town really do treat me different than my white battle buddies." "You're not paranoid," David assured him. "And you're not alone. That's why we have to speak up, to support each other, to demand better." General Washington arrived later, having changed into civilian clothes but still carrying herself with military bearing. She pulled David aside for a private conversation. "The Secretary of Defense wants to expand your role," she said. "Not just liaison work, but developing a nationwide program. Training materials, oversight protocols, accountability measures. It's a big job, David. Bigger than anything you've done before. Bigger than coordinating supply lines for an entire forward operating base," David asked with a slight smile. "Different kind of logistics," Washington replied. "Instead of moving materials, you'll be moving minds. Changing culture. That's the hardest mission there is." David thought about Blake's admission in court, about the 15 years of unchecked racism and violence, about all the victims who'd never see justice. "When do I start?" "Monday. We're giving you an office at the Pentagon and a team of analysts, lawyers, and reform advocates. Your first meeting is with the International Association of Chiefs of Police. They're scared, David. Blake's conviction has them realizing that the old ways won't work anymore." "Good. Fear can be a powerful motivator for change." As the community gathering wound down, David helped stack chairs and clean up, refusing special treatment despite his still healing shoulder. It was in these simple acts of community that he found something like peace. This was what Blake had tried to destroy. Not just David's life, but the bonds that held communities together, the trust that made society function. Luis Gonzalez appeared at the end of the evening wearing Army recruiter's casual clothes. "I signed up," he said simply. "Military police. I figure if I'm going to serve and protect, I might as well do it in a system that actually values integrity." "It won't be easy," David warned. "Different challenges, same fundamental issues around power and accountability." "I know, but at least there's the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Clear rules, clear consequences. That's more than I had at Riverside PD." They shook hands, 2 men who'd been brought together by violence but were choosing to move forward through service. It wasn't redemption. Gonzalez would always carry the weight of his initial inaction. But it was a start. That night, David sat on his grandmother's porch one last time before returning to his military duties. Tomorrow he'd drive to Fort Stewart, to clear out his office, hand over his logistics responsibilities, and prepare for his new role. Margaret sat beside him, the night sounds of Riverside creating a familiar symphony. "Your grandfather would be proud," she said softly. Standing up, speaking out, then working to fix things. That's what he always said real courage looked like. "I don't feel courageous," David admitted. "I feel tired, and angry, and sometimes hopeless about how much needs to change. Baby feeling all that, and still choosing to do the work. That's the very definition of courage." A car drove slowly past, and David tensed involuntarily, his body still expecting threat. It would take time, maybe years, before that hypervigilance faded. Blake had stolen his sense of safety in his own hometown, had turned every police car into a potential danger. That was a wound that would outlast the physical scar on his shoulder. But as David watched the car continue on, just another resident heading home, he thought about the young Marine who'd approached him earlier, about Luis Gonzalez, choosing a different path, about the federal investigations, expanding across multiple states. Change was happening, incremental, but real. His phone buzzed with a text from General Washington. "CNN wants an exclusive about the new program. Can you do it before Monday?" David looked at the message, then at his grandmother, then at the stars visible, despite the suburban light pollution. The same stars he'd navigated by in Afghanistan, that his ancestors had followed to freedom, that would shine long after all of them were gone. "Yes," he typed back. "The story needs to be told." Because that was his mission now. Not just to heal from his own trauma, but to prevent others from experiencing it. Not just to see Blake convicted, but to dismantle the system that had created and protected him. Not just to survive, but to ensure that survival meant something. The work would be hard, the resistance fierce, the progress slow. But Major David Carter had faced Taliban fighters in mountain passes, had coordinated supply lines under mortar fire, had survived being shot by someone sworn to protect him. He could handle whatever came next. As he stood to go inside, David paused at the door, looking back at Commerce Boulevard in the distance. The bloodstains had been washed away, the crime scene tape removed, the media vans departed. But the change that had started there, with a routine traffic stop that became anything but routine, that change was just beginning. Blake would serve his 25 years testifying against his former colleagues, living with the knowledge of what he'd done. The officers he implicated would face their own trials, their own reckonings. The Riverside Police Department would be rebuilt, hopefully, into something worthy of the community's trust. And Major David Carter would continue to serve, just in a different battlefield, fighting a different kind of war. The war for justice, for accountability, for the promise that one day no one would have to fear those sworn to protect them.